that's never shown on me. I want my whole life to be.
I have given a name to my pain, and it is whoever gave Joaquin Phoenix singing lessons. Jesse Shade here as your host for Awfully Good Movies on behalf of the JoBlo YouTube network. And while all this hubbub over the 97th Academy Awards has us all discussing what the best films of last year were, I'm unfortunately here to poop the party with my list for the worst films of 2024. You heard me right, folks, my list this year. No critical consensuses or viewer polls be considered, just my personal opinion on what I thought were the worst movies of what I saw last year. After all, to paraphrase the late great David Lynch, 2024 was a great year to be a cinema lover.
If you love the theater of the absurd.
And how could you get more absurd than Chris Pratt voicing Garfield, Zachary Levi playing a 4-year-old boy, the two worst things to happen to the Spider-Verse since that Broadway musical, and of course Joker, Folie, Deux, which is surprisingly no longer the most hated movie musical to come out last year.
Man to woman.
From penis to vagina.
13 Oscar nominations for that, you say. And who says that Hollywood is out of touch?
Yes.
So without further ado, the JoBlo YouTube network and Awfully Good Movies present my picks for the top 10 worst movies of 2024.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Number 10, Joker, Folie, Deux. Todd Phillips' Joker was nothing short of a big deal back in 2019, winning Joaquin Phoenix the second Oscar for an actor playing Gotham City's Clown Prince of Crime, and becoming the first R-rated movie to break $1 billion worldwide, even as many critics scoffed at its obvious influence from Martin Scorsese's filmography. But critics and audiences were equally confused by its studio-mandated sequel, where director Todd Phillips would now take influence from Francis Ford Coppola's musical drama flop, One from the Heart, and make a musical out of the tragic tale of the imprisoned Arthur Fleck now falling in love with the Joker's devout fan and future queen, Harley Quinn, played and sung by the one and only Lady Gaga. It's definitely a way more ambitious idea than anything else from the end of the DCEU, but it's also a terrible idea when you've got vocal powerhouse Lady Gaga singing old show tunes with vocal slaughterhouse Joaquin Phoenix, whose singing voice from Walk the Line has now aged to sound more like Johnny Cash on his final recordings before he died.
For once in my life, I got freedom.
I don't want to sing anymore.
And without this half-baked musical gimmick, Joker Part 2 isn't much more than a shallow commentary against all the incel fanboys who mistakenly thought Arthur Fleck was the hero of the first movie, with most of the film examining the events of the first Joker in a courtroom, instead of doing anything substantial with Lady Gaga's Harley Quinn or the rest of this big-name supporting cast. It's as if we're being punished for wanting to see any more of Arthur Fleck's miserable life in the first place, right down to that infamous third act where he gets shivved to death by a fellow inmate who then starts slicing his face open to become the actual Joker, meaning that the two movies that were titled Joker were not actually about the Joker, and that the joke was on us in the audience all along.
Yeah, that's not funny.
However, with this sequel having such big-name defenders in its corner as Quentin Tarantino, John Waters, Hideo Kojima, and even Francis Ford Coppola himself, I will at least give this flick some credit for doing something new and challenging with the comic book property, even if it didn't need to burn $200 million like the Joker to do so. But for us casual fans of the first movie who didn't need to be lectured to, the second Joker is mostly a slog of a sequel that reeks of Todd Phillips' contempt for having to make it, which, considering his history with the Hangover sequels, shouldn't have been that much of a surprise. God forbid James Gunn is going to be greenlighting any further musical sequels for the new DCU.
Come on, pal, let's go. My knees.
Stop singing.
Number 9, Megalopolis. Speaking of Francis Ford Coppola, the legendary filmmaker and wine enthusiast came back to the director's chair at the ripe age of 85. by selling off $120 million of his vineyard fortunes and assembling an all-star cast to finally make the passion project he's had in his head for over 40 years. A sci-fi fable set in a future America that has remodeled itself after the Roman Empire, where the only thing saving us from our downfall is Adam Driver as revolutionary architect Caesar Canalina, who wants to reimagine New York City, or rather New Rome, as some kind of real-life society if mean. Despite the objections of the corrupt status quo, made up of Giancarlo Esposito as the unpopular mayor, Aubrey Plaza as a vapid news reporter named Wow Platinum, Shia LaBeouf as Caesar's jealous cousin who's prone to dressing up in drag, and John Voight as Caesar's elderly uncle who shoots his former Holes co-star in the ass with an arrow he shoots from his dick. Don't even ask. It's one of many nonsensical elements brought about by Coppola's chaotic production methods. Letting actors improvise, smoking weed out in his trailer, getting smooshy with female extras, and having members of the special effects team getting fired or leaving throughout production, which can most definitely be seen in the final product. That feels more like the best-worst movie that Neil Breen has yet to make than it does the likely final film from the director of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. There's very little plot or character to shape this very old man's ramblings about the state of post-9/11 America into an actual story, with all the big-name actors from Lawrence Fishburne to Dustin Hoffman looking lost as how they can say this shit without breaking into laughter.
And you're gonna play by my rules.
So go back to the club, back to the club, back to the club.
Yet, with Megalopolis also having some big names in cinema sticking up for its quality online, I can say in the film's favor that it's refreshing to see a positive vision of humanity's future for once, even if Coppola's solution for humanity seems to be turning cities into glorified airport lobbies and changing the words to the Pledge of Allegiance so they're now addressed to Mother Nature. I guess. At least we can now say that Michael Jackson's Captain EO or Robin Williams' Jack are no longer the weirdest entry in Mr. Coppola's legendary filmography. Unless he gets into the winery again and drunkenly comes up with one last script for The Godfather Part 4.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Number 8. The Garfield Movie. Whether or not you're a fan of Jim Davis's long-running comic strip, the titular character of Garfield the cat has endured over the past 40 years as a pop culture icon. From his classic cartoon show and specials of the 80s, voiced by the late great Lorenzo Music, to his not-so-beloved live-action movies of the 2000s, voiced by an audibly bored Bill Murray.
So do you have any regrets?
Garfield, maybe?
And who better to follow in their grumpy paw prints for Garfield's very first fully animated theatrical movie than the comedic genius of
Chris Pratt. He's so cool.
Well, he's not the actor from Parks and Recreation I would choose to voice a grumpy cat, but hey, we all thought his voice work as Mario was tolerable?
He's so cool.
Yet Chris Pratt's uninspired casting and half-hearted voice performance makes sense when you see how they've taken any edge out of Garfield whatsoever. He's hardly all that lazy, he barely eats any lasagna, and he's caught up with his mute canine pal Odie in a needlessly complicated plot of trying to reconcile with Garfield's absentee father, who's part of a gang of literal cat burglars trying to steal some milk from a dairy corporation. Just like the comic strips of my childhood? It feels more like a rejected draft script for the Bad Guys sequel than it ever does a Garfield adaptation, complete with all the kids' movie cliches of a generic pop soundtrack, a useless cameo from Snoop Dogg, and blatant product placement for the fucking Olive Garden. The real Garfield would never dare eating that corporate slop. You might as well next put him on Ozempic. The rest of the Garfield movie is not without some nice animation, and the rest of the voice cast trying its best. Nicholas Hoult does a good John Arbuckle, Harvey Guillen does a great Odie, and Samuel L. Jackson as Garfield's father, well, that's just smart casting.
That's all you had to say.
But speaking personally as a childhood Garfield fan who was let down by its first screen adaptation, I think the animated Garfield movie simply does very little to improve in quality, and we can only hope they introduce Aubrey Plaza as Nermal to hopefully improve the sequel.
And you're gonna play by my rules.
Number 7. Argylle. Even with British director Matthew Vaughn no longer making Kingsman movies, that sure didn't stop him from making yet another big-budget spy caper with a cheeky sense of humor and an all-star cast. In this original tale about Bryce Dallas Howard as the best-selling author of a book series concerning the action-packed adventures of Master Spy Agent Argylle, played in her imagination by Henry Cavill, who along with her adorable pet cat crosses paths on a train with Sam Rockwell as an actual spy, who needs her help after her books have successfully been predicting the future of an actual spy agency led by her fake dad, Bryan Cranston. On paper, it seems like a clever premise that crosses over Mission Impossible with Romancing the Stone. But as an actual movie, it feels like Matthew Vaughn overdosing on all the stylish action and campy humor that already got old with those Kingsman movies. With an incredible cast ranging from Samuel L. Jackson to Catherine O'Hara, from John Cena to Dua Lipa, all wasted at the mercy of a confusing plot filled with more ridiculous twists than Shyamalan's last movie. And to make this over-stylized nonsense so much worse, the ending not only reveals that Henry Cavill was an actual spy all along, but that he's also a member of the Kingsmen, in an end credits stinger teasing Matthew Vaughn's plans for a spy-related cinematic universe with Kingsmen that Disney will thankfully not allow to happen. Even with Apple Original Films spending a whopping $200 million on this flick, Argylle couldn't even muster $50 million at the box office, before quickly heading over to Apple TV Plus, where it should have stayed. Though Matthew Vaughn stands by this movie and is willing to make a sequel if Apple wants one, I would recommend he stay away from the spy genre for a while, so he can hopefully return to his former heights of cinematic greatness. Let's hope his next movie won't have a title that stupid people will mispronounce, like The Old Man from A Christmas Story.
Argylle. It must be Italian.
Number 6. Unfrosted. What was the deal with Jerry Seinfeld in 2024? The poor guy made the news so much for stupid out-of-context statements he's made on podcasts that it's easy to forget that he was promoting an actual movie on Netflix last year, where the former sitcom star and serial enthusiast made his directorial debut on a comedic biopic about Kellogg's invention of the Pop-Tart in the early 60s, with Jerry in the role of Kellogg's head of development coming up with the microwavable pastry, along with help from an all-star cast of all the comedians you keep saying are overrated now on social media. While it's not at all a bad idea to parody the same kind of brand biopic that's been popular in Hollywood these days, it is when you team Seinfeld back up with the same running team of Seinfeld alumni that gave us B-Movie.
You like jazz?
Which frankly looks like Hayao Miyazaki compared to Unfrosted, a film that has nothing but Seinfeld and company riffing on jokes about the 1960s and Kellogg's fine line of products for 90 minutes with next to no dramatic structure. On a few occasions it's funny, like seeing Hugh Grant in the role of Tony the Tiger actor Thurl Ravenscroft. But more often, it's awkwardly unfunny, like when Hugh Grant stages a January 6th type attack on the Kellogg's offices. Yep, that happens. It feels more like a series of Super Bowl commercials than it does a movie, namely an appearance from Jon Hamm and John Slattery back as their Mad Men characters. That'll just make you feel like sad men. But humor is, as always, subjective, and clearly enough people found this flick funny enough to earn Unfrosted an Emmy nomination for Outstanding TV Movie. But for me, Unfrosted is a complete dud, which ironically proves Jerry Seinfeld's comments about comedy no longer being funny and movies now being dead to quite possibly be true. And if Netflix is even thinking about giving Jerry Seinfeld another paycheck to make B-Movie 2, I swear to God, I'll be furious.
Stop laughing. It's not funny.
Number 5, Harold and the Purple Crayon. Oh, Zachary Levi. The man has had an undeniable internet meltdown for the ages since that last Shazam movie bombed.
We had an awesome scene that would have tied me in.
Shut up, bitch!
And nowhere was his mental health more in doubt when he agreed to star in this adaptation of Crockett Johnson's beloved 1955 children's book. But how is it that 44-year-old Zachary Levi can play this 4-year-old child? Why, by making it a sequel, with a now grown-up Harold drawing a portal from his book's world to the modern-day real world, while still wearing his childhood pajamas that makes him look one mask away from becoming Michael Myers. It's a horrifically cynical way to extend the 64-page book into a 90-minute movie that feels more like a cheap knockoff of Elf, complete with Zooey Deschanel as the single mom who sees nothing wrong with her son befriending this grown-ass man-boy with the eyes of a psychopath, and even gives Harold a job in some blatant product placement for Ollie's Bargain Outlet. Yeah, this feels like a movie I would find for $3 on DVD in an actual Ollie's store. And with Lil Ray Howery providing Lil comic relief as Harold's moose buddy who turns human in the real world, the film's precious few laughs belong to Jermaine Clement as a failed fantasy author villain who wants to use the magic crayon to cosplay himself as a warrior from his books, which I'm sure Crockett Johnson would have been totally cool with. Also, the film gets weirdly somber when Harold discovers his literary creator has been dead for the past 50 years. And Zachary Levi is all sorts of off-putting trying to keep his man-child shtick from Shazam going without the DC branding. So it's no surprise that Netflix actually rejected Sony's offer to have them distribute this crap instead, leaving the film to spectacularly bomb at the box office.
That's the end of the story.
And with this film being the live-action debut for animator Carlos Saldana of the sadly extinct Blue Sky Studios, this would have been so much better as a fully animated movie. Instead of this loud live-action garbage, that's everything wrong with children's entertainment today. Looks like I owe an apology to Mike Myers for being so mean to what he did with the Cat in the Hat. Hey, wait a minute. No, I don't! Number 4. Dear Santa. 2024 was certainly not the best year for Jack Black, who after putting Tenacious D on hold over a stupid joke and the endless amount of mockery towards his Minecraft movie trailer, is in danger of becoming an internet punching bag. Well, what better way to win back the audience than by re-teaming with his old Shallow Hal directors, the Farrelly brothers, teaming back up to make their first comedy in a decade after Peter Farrelly's Oscar wins for Green Book and Bobby Farrelly's solo directorial debut, Champions. Now with Bobby on directing duty and Peter on co-writing duty for this Paramount Plus exclusive movie about a geeky dyslexic 6th grader named Liam who writes a letter asking for help with his crumbling family from Santa Claus, only for Liam to misspell the recipient's name and having his wishes answered instead by Satan, who now acts as a mischievous genie to this kid to answer his wishes and sign a contract for his soul. What could be a great demonstration of Jack Black's still agile comedic talents is instead a demonstration of how much the Farrelly brothers have lost their own talents in the 10 years since Dumb and Dumber 2, looking just about as cheap as a streaming movie gets. There's an especially awkward cameo from Post Malone where this kid dances on stage with him and Satan, where his audience looks as big as that of a demolition derby. Though Jack Black does land a laugh or two, the jokes they give him and this poor kid are hardly jokes at all, especially when the Farrellys introduce a subplot in the third act out of nowhere about this kid's recently dead brother.
It was an accident.
Which pays off in the worst possible way with an ending where Satan brings the dead brother back to life on Christmas Day. No questions asked, and nobody screaming in terror. How is it that this ending pissed me off way more than the one for Joker 2? It is sadly appropriate that Jack Black shares a scene alongside Ben Stiller, because this feels all too similar to the same kind of garbage that his character from Tropic Thunder would have starred in. I think the Farrellys could have made a far better return to comedy than this lump of Christmas coal, and that Jack Black needs to have a good long talk with his agent already, especially as we get to his next appearance on my worst list.
Oh man!
Number 3, Borderlands. While video game movies and TV shows are getting far better than they were in the past, no one gave that memo to horror director Eli Roth before he agreed to make an adaptation of the role-playing first-person shooter game series, where players loot and shoot on the dystopian mining planet of Pandora. Sure, it may not be as popular as it was 15 years ago, but just look at the big-name cast they had here. Cate Blanchett as Lilith, the badass bounty hunter who's hired by an evil corporate honcho to bring back his mischievous missing daughter, Tiny Tita, played by Ariana Greenblatt, who form an unlikely alliance of misfits made up of Kevin Hart as a mercenary soldier, Jamie Lee Curtis as Lilith's scientist foster mother, Jack Black once again as the appropriately annoying voice of their helpful robot, Claptrap, and some guy who's basically just Drax the Destroyer, because this is basically just ripping off the same group dynamics of Guardians of the Galaxy. except with next to no chemistry and barely any classic rock on the soundtrack. Plus, this casting is just plain wrong. 55-year-old Cate Blanchett as Lilith, with Jamie Lee Curtis as her foster mom only being 10 years older than her, Kevin Hart playing someone several inches taller than him, and Gina Gershon as Mad Moxie at the age of 60? Christina Hendricks was right fucking there! And yet that casting was only slightly worse than the movie itself, shifting in tone frequently thanks to a rewritten script from Last of Us show creator Craig Mazin that he had his name taken off of in favor of the pseudonym Joe Crombie. And obvious reshoots added 2 years after the movie had wrapped up from Deadpool director Tim Miller, while Eli Roth was making the way better Thanksgiving. Whether or not you're a fan of these video games, Borderlands is a disgrace to cinema all the same, no matter what series creator Randy Pitchford keeps insisting to fans on social media. And you can thank its producer Avi Arad for his continued commitment to IP-based garbage that hardly gives a shit about its source material. Which leads into the next Avi Arad production I have next on my list.
Oh man!
Number 2, Kraven the Hunter. At long last, Sony Pictures' Spider-Man universe that barely had Spider-Man in it came to a close in 2024 with a trio of appropriately disappointing entries. But the third Venom movie had a comparatively easy next to the SSU's final entry, about the origin story for another iconic Spider-Man villain, Sergei the Hunter Kravenov, known to Spidey fans as the Russian big game hunter who wants to hang Peter Parker over his wall, with Aaron Taylor Johnson returning to comic book flicks after his brief stint as Quicksilver to play the titular hunter. But even as this franchise's first R-rated entry from the Oscar-nominated director of Margin Call, the blood and F-bombs cannot hide how utterly wrong Kraven the Hunter gets its title character, who gets his animalistic powers from having his wounds healed from a lion fight with a magic serum, and is now able to talk with these CGI animals and fight on their behalf like he's Dr. Dolittle with a license to kill instead of being a professional hunter. And Aaron Taylor Johnson doesn't even bother with the Russian accent like his dad Russell Crowe does, which just sounds like his Greek accent from the last Thor movie. Plus, Alessandro Nivola is somehow even more ridiculous than Paul Giamatti was as the Rhino, whose rhino form makes him look like a dried dog turd with a horn on top, while Ariana DeBose as the voodoo priestess Calypso has the most laughable line of dialogue from this franchise since the one about Madame Web's mom.
She died not long after that trip, and I never saw her again.
But a distinguished cast and director could not save Kraven from the same flaws that bogged down all of Sony's Marvel movies. Cheesy script writing, CGI overloaded fight sequences, and forcing in other Marvel characters such as the Chameleon to help tease further sequels we don't want to see. And after a long-delayed release from the Hollywood strikes, Kraven dropped in the Christmas season to be met with Sony Pictures' worst debut in years. According to the company's outgoing CEO, who defends Kraven the Hunter as, quote, not a bad film that just got crucified by the press. As for myself, I will gladly crucify what is a sad end for a sad excuse of a superhero franchise that's only ever existed out of Sony's legal spite towards their agreement with Marvel Studios, and which would be the worst superhero movie that I saw last year. That is, if it weren't for my number 1 worst movie of 2024, and perhaps one of the worst movies we will ever see this decade. Number 1, Madame Web. Not even the likes of Morbius or Kraven could prepare us for the SSU's magnum opus of shittery. An origin story for the paralyzed and clairvoyant mutant who helps predict Spider-Man's tragic fate. Played here in her youth by Dakota Johnson, as an ambulance driver who gets mysterious psychic powers, and given the task of saving 3 future Spider-Women from being killed by the spider-suited evil explorer, Ezekiel Sims.
He was in the Amazon with my mom when
Yes, we all know about the infamous line of dialogue from Madame Web's much-mocked first trailer that displayed the flick's cheap costume work on its female leads, and clumsy references to the Spider-Man lore in a universe where Spider-Man doesn't even exist yet. But even that trailer could not prepare us for the actual movie to come. The terrible editing and time-hopping plot that will induce either seizures or headaches. the incredibly obvious dub work on Tahar Rahim that looks straight out of a 70s kung fu movie.
You have no idea of the torment and torture of dying.
The obscene product placement for Pepsi Cola, the cheap-looking effects that just reuse scenes from earlier in the movie, and a largely lost-looking cast wasting such talents as Sydney Sweeney, Adam Scott as a young Uncle Ben, and of course Dakota Johnson acting just as enthusiastic in the movie as she was on its press tour.
Ben, what are you even doing back there? Take this seriously.
And whatever relation this all has to any of the Marvel universes is never made clear, outside of a prenatal cameo from an infant Peter Parker, with director S.J. Clarkson displaying none of the talent she's shown previously directing Marvel-based TV shows, probably due to all the creative interference from Sony executives that Dakota Johnson blamed for the movie's subpar quality. And yet, even with Madam Web becoming as much of an internet punchline as Morbius has, Sony's outgoing CEO has still insisted that Madam Web and Kraven the Hunter are both actually quality works of cinema, because he is apparently as blind as Madam Web herself. This is just about as laughable and lazily constructed as superhero movies get. A new low for the Sony Spider-Verse and Marvel adaptations in general that ends up being a special kind of terrible. One that clearly merits being my #1 worst movie of 2024. And thus the SSU ends the same way it began way back in 2018.
Like a turd in the wind.
It sure is, Venom, and this cinematic universe has indeed been one big turd.
I won't forget you, buddy.
Excelsior!
I'm Jesse Shade for the JoBlo YouTube network, and thanks for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to the JoBlo Awfully Good Movies channel. Tell all your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all our latest videos. We are an independent company that appreciates all of your support. And we'll be seeing you viewers here again in 2025 when we'll be talking about why Disney's Snow White remake and the Minecraft movie went so horribly wrong. Hey, if either of the makers of those movies are watching this show, then by all means, folks, prove me wrong. Prove me wrong.
It's over.
Come on in, come to the place where fun never
If you like what you see, please subscribe to the JoBlo YouTube
Garfield
network.
and friends. Come on in, it's time to party with Garfield and friends. Garfield and friends.
What do you think of this boner I got?
It's such a sadness.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.